A huge thank you for everyone, to everybody for joining us today. We've got another brilliant conversation lined up for you as part of the IGON Conversation With series. And today I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Tony Edwards from StructChange Global, who's the CEO. And we're going to be talking about the outlook for oil and gas for the future, which is, I think, a much anticipated subject right now. So I'm going to hand over the conversation to both Murray and Tony, and look forward very much to the outcome of this webinar.
Probably one of the most interesting is what's coming up. What's the outlook for like the next 2 years in oil and gas?
Good question, Murray. I mean, I think there's going to be, I think operating companies are probably going to fall into two camps. So they're going to be those who kind of shut down and pull all the normal levers around how to optimize their business and focusing on the standard levers of production and operations, OPEX reduction. And I think the other companies are going to be saying, actually, this is a moment in time where we need to do something more radical than that, and we actually need to transform the way we run our businesses. And the common themes that we're hearing is around digital enablement and how that can transform your business, but also looking at the way businesses are run in terms of operational models, organizational models. And we're seeing a trend towards remote operations to minimally staffed operations, reducing staff at operational sites, and moving to this kind of operate and manage by exception model. So really, you know, we're seeing the opportunity in the offshore world for significantly lowering persons on board, reducing the OPEX that way, reducing the work, transferring roles from offshore to onshore. And in land-based operations, we're seeing that materialize itself in terms of, you know, visit frequencies. How often do you need to visit a well pad or a small oil and gas facility, you know, typically around, you know, shale oil, shale gas operations, those kind of things.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think of all the different types of oil production company there are, how they're going to be affected. Because well, let's just think for a minute about, like, you've got from mature fields, where there's to offshore mature fields, which have got, say, an old asset, maybe it's producing reasonably well. Then you've got onshore fields, lots of wells, but very low production. And then you've got new projects that actually have quite high deliverability because they're new, latest technology, but they need investing in. They need, and then you've got, I guess, the toss up between oil and gas, which to go for.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of trends. I mean, first of all, if you look at greenfield, I mean, there are some types of areas and sectors and basins which are inherently high cost, and it's hard to get away from that. So it's hard to see, unless you've got extremely good reservoir, how deep water is going to fly at the moment. It's just very expensive, and there's not much you can do to counter the physics of deep water. It's high pressure, you need lots of metal, it's just inherently going to be expensive. And I think we see the same with some of the oil sand operations in Alberta, specifically SAGD. It just costs a lot of money to produce steam to get the oil and gas out of the ground. So I think we're going to fall back to the old adage of, you know, good rock is king. If you've got good reservoir, good productive reservoirs, then that's a massive help in the first place, whether they're oil or gas. And then I think beyond that, there's going to be a move towards more gas. I think the business model around gas and LNG for long-term contracts is more sustainable. There's going to be less variation. There's going to be less short-term variation in those kind of projects. So I think if you're looking for greenfield projects, you know, we would be backing gas projects, LNG projects, and oil projects in highly productive, you know, basins which are not, you know, isolated or stranded potentially.
Do you think we might actually see a shift then, like a renewing of the asset base, or the production asset base in oil and gas, where a lot of the older assets get decommissioned because they're just not viable, and it's actually the new projects that are viable?
So I think there's, you know, there's a couple of trends here around, you know, tying in to existing infrastructure so you can reduce the cost that way. I mean, clearly, you know, so there is going to be some renewal in current basins like the North Sea. But the problem with that is some of the infrastructure is also disappearing. I mean, V Fields, which was run by ConocoPhillips for many years, is gone. So any of the gas pockets which are around there, you know, the tying distances are going to be increasingly large, and that's probably going to mean that those gas pockets or oil pockets are going to get stranded. So I think there are some issues around that. I think when it comes to, you know, shortening of field life, clearly the lower oil price shortens the field life of many of the assets which we're familiar with in the North Sea. But also my concern is that the window of opportunity to make significant improvements to extend field life may have been missed in the North Sea. That's my concern, you know, because if you're going to, you know, when you look at demanning or you look at digitalizing these assets, you know, you do have to spend some money, but if the end of field life is so close that you can't spend any money at all, then it makes it very difficult to justify.
But that's a really interesting point, actually. It's not, that angle is not something I'd actually thought about in some previous questions we've had, because one of the things we thought about was the difficulty of doing it now post coronavirus lockdown issues is that it's now extremely difficult to mobilize anyone. So if you want to do these improvement projects, they actually become harder to do for the time being with all the travel restrictions in place. That will go away, you'd think, given enough time, like 18 months or something. But what you're saying actually is if you shorten the field life, then if you combine that with possibly it's harder to do anyway, it's just...
Yeah, and you know, some of the operations that you've been very familiar with your client base recently. I mean, you know, one of the case studies for extending field life and using digitalization to do that was the Braga platform when it was, you know, pre the Statoil Hydro merger. So Hydro actually spent quite a lot of money upgrading the connectivity and implementing integrated operations in a period between 2005 and 2007. And at that point, their driver was to extend the field life. And what they managed to do was increase production from around 7,000 barrels a day to 10,000 barrels a day. And they also managed to drop the POB from 52 to 22. And actually what that did was at the time extend the field life by 5, 6, 7 years. And in fact, Braga is still going under different ownership and they're doing the same again. But the problem is I think if they hadn't have done that in the 2005 to 2007 period, it would never have got to the point where it is now. And if you were trying to start now, it would be too late, I think. And I think that's one of the problems with the brownfields. You have to have sufficient field life left to make it worthwhile spending at least some money.
Yeah, that's quite a good point. So what you're saying is the early intervention, and when I say early, in the field life actually saved its bacon in many ways, and it has extended it.
Yes, and what I would say is that, you know, when I was in BP in Southern North Sea in the mid to late 90s, we were in the fortunate position of not only were most of the platforms 30 or even 40 years old, but they still had probably 20 plus years lifetime on them. And that was the time to spend money. And so we spent money simplifying them and dropping the OPEX and making them more reliable and allowing us to move to, for the unmanned platforms, instead of going once a week or once every 2 weeks, to going once every 2 months or once every 3 months. So, you know, the human side of the OPEX almost collapsed to nothing at all. And that made them economically viable within BP for a lot longer than other assets that they inherited from Amoco, but also meant it was attractive to Perenco. And if you look at those assets, they're still going now. They're still viable at very low production rates because the OPEX is extremely low. That's
a really interesting point, and it illustrates one of the realities of as the technology changes, that the same example was given of the shift from steam to electricity, where on the incremental business case, it didn't really make sense to switch from steam to electric. But the problem was there comes an inflection point. Something happens, an external event, and it shifts the landscape such that only electricity-based manufacturing became viable, and all the steam ones just went out of business, and it happened almost overnight. And so you go from a place where in your spreadsheet model, it didn't really make sense. You couldn't justify the project on the, say, the short time frame, but actually, if you didn't do it, you were going to go out of business, but that never appeared in the models.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we've also seen, and whether that's applying, you know, digital to greenfield or brownfield, is where you draw the boundary on your project has a huge influence on whether it's going to fly or not. Because at the end of the day, you know, one of the big problems with things like machine learning and analytics and applying that to maintenance of, you know, equipment on an offshore platform is, at the end of the day, you have to spend some money to get to the point where it's useful. But, you know, the big question is okay, if you implement machine learning and analytics on the suite of equipment that you've got offshore, how many less technicians do you need? And that's not an easy question to answer. It's actually easier on a brownfield than on a greenfield. But if you're on a greenfield and you say you implement all this stuff, are you willing to have the number of maintenance technicians you have up front or not? And that's very difficult to do. And it's actually that's the trade-off. So for an operations manager or an asset manager, he's going to be thinking, okay, if we're going to pay for this data collection, the instrumentation, all of the things that we need to move to this new digitally enabled you know, world, you know, how many less people am I actually going to have at the site? And that's very difficult to answer.
So yeah, so up front it's very difficult to put the real cost savings.
Well, and I think the problem is it, you know, you need, and you know, very old term, but the whole holistic approach, in the fact that, you know, any one of these technologies individually is unlikely to get you to the point where it makes a significant difference. It's the aggregate of all the technologies, including high bandwidth comms, the ability to store data, clean up data, analyze data, do the analytics, and ultimately make a decision which is different than you would have done if you didn't have it.
Yeah, okay.
And that's the issue. So when people come along and say, you know, machine learning can give you this, or analytics can give you that, or high bandwidth comms can give you that, well, you can only do the analytics and machine learning if you actually have got the instrumentation, you've got the communications, you've got the storage, you've got the ability to QA, clean up your data, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you distribute the value from the business case across that suite of technologies?
No, that's a great point. And you don't actually get the benefit until they all come together. It's sort of like the bucket with a hole in it.
You get a limited benefit. You get a limited benefit. And what you see in the history of this is, you know, there are a number of key enabling technologies there which do unlock this. And, you know, if you dial all the way back to the early days of digital oil field and integrated operations, the one key technology that unlocked everything was bandwidth. You know, and if you know, because, you know, if the data was stranded on your platform, on your operational site, you were kind of stuck. And that still is the case in some operations in remote locations, especially land-based operations. It still seems to be a bit of an issue. It's still an issue, you know, in remote offshore operations. But, you know, you can see the history of somebody like, you know, ConocoPhillips Ecofisk. You know, they started with 10 megabytes of bandwidth in 2003. They went to 30 megabytes, they went to 50 megabytes, they went to 100 megabytes, they went to 300 megabytes, and they went to a gigabyte.
Yeah, okay.
And what you see is that the first 10 megabytes allowed them to do a certain amount, which then justified you know, the value they attained, and then managed to justify by you know, doing, you know, unlocking the bandwidth. And, you know, now we're in the fortunate position that if you've got a fiber to your offshore platform or to your onshore operation, essentially bandwidth is unlimited.
Yeah.
And you know, it's only expensive if the commercial provider or the local entity, you know, telecoms, government entities make it expensive. you know, I mean, once it's there, it's relatively low cost. And certainly for all new greenfield projects, if you're laying a pipeline, the cost of laying a fiber on the back of the pipeline is insignificant. So those things are going away unless you're somewhere trying to develop something north of the Falklands or something, you know, in which case you've still got a problem. But it is surprising, you know, where, you know, when I was still working for BG, we visited Karachaganak in 2008, and they had full fiber, you know, to Karachaganak in 2008 in the middle of nowhere in Kazakhstan.
So are you saying actually that there's something in the mindset of just continuously trying to push things forward, even though you can't write a clear business case in terms of, well, it's this much value, that actually there's a number of other things that come into the equation in addition to just dollars that are really important. So for example, to give you a little example, we're talking about investing up front. You don't know where the end goal is, but by taking the first step, you sort of unlock what's next. So although you don't know where the whole way goes, you just install 10 megabits. Like, oh, let's just do something that's interesting and we might learn from. And that unlocks the next piece of learning.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. It's the term that we've used to describe this is called earn and learn. So, you know, earn some money, get some benefit, and learn how to do it as you go along. And this is the way of thinking about it is very much, what do you need to do by the end of the year to add some value and learn how to get to the next piece and what you're going to do next year. And unfortunately, you know, many of us are trained as engineers, and we get this blueprint and roadmap idea. And of course, the blueprint idea is a blueprint is fixed. So you know exactly where you're going, and the roadmap tells you exactly how to get there. And I think the nature of what we've been doing with digitalization of oil and gas and integrated operations is it's just not like that. It is very much that you may not know. You know, you've got a vision, you've got a high level understanding of where you're trying to get to, but in detail you don't know where you're going to end up. And in actual fact, spending a lot of time trying to work that out may be counterproductive rather than just starting on it. You know, so I think, you know, there is a definite you know, almost mind shift that is there, which means, you know, just start and work it out to an extent, work it out as you go along, have some vision, have some goals, but you don't need to know everything in detail to start.
But that's a fascinating analogy to just software development, actually, and the whole agile process. Because one of the challenges is with something like software, you don't actually know everything you have to do up front. And in order to know everything you need to do, you have to just go build it the first time. And it's only by actually going through it that you're able to properly flush out what you need.
Yeah, yes, I think there is that. I mean, the other thing that we've seen previously in trying to engage with assets inside organizations is that, you know, having a very large dollar number on the end of it, you know, certainly often didn't make any difference to anybody and didn't make people do it. I mean, certainly my experience was, you know, you could go to an operational asset, either offshore or onshore, and you could dangle 10, 50, 100, 300, $500 million of benefit under their nose, which was relatively easily capturable. And it never made anybody do anything. And certainly that was the case at $100 barrel oil. That was not the key to get them to doing anything. You know, and so that, you know, that you know, quantitative business case that we all know and love, and NPVs and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, you know, you absolutely need that to convince somebody to give you the money to do something. You know, it's what you need to convince the CFO, but I'm not sure it's what convinces a project director or an operational manager. And so the kind of things that I think you need to do for that, for engineers and asset managers is convince them, you know, what's in it for them, how are their daily lives going to improve, how's it going to make their operations improve, how's it going to improve everything that they're doing on a daily basis. And that's a qualitative story. That's a story about how you were before you had the ability to have real-time data and information and collaborate and share, versus, versus now when you've got it, and how that changes the daily work patterns and how your organization works. And I think the other thing about it is that, you know, there needs to be some sort, we call this the enabling business case, but it would be, what's the burning bridge? What is it that you've got to do tomorrow that you can't do today, and you've got no choice?
Yeah.
And our friend in what was Ciro, Judd Jacobs, has often said this: there's two drivers in life, greed and fear trumps greed. And so what we're seeing now, I think, is that there are companies who are beginning to say, hell, if we don't do something drastic, we might not be here at the end of the year or the end of next year. And so we have to do this. We have to do something transformational. And so I think in some respects, the current environment is potentially going to make it easier to do some of this organizational transformation.
I think transformation's a journey. So having seen transformation in different industries, I think you're right in what you're saying. It's about taking on different parts of the business and taking them on that journey and realizing that value that's going to be delivered through the work that you'll do. I think what's been fascinating for me to see is how that's being applied to oil and gas at the moment, and actually seeing how some people are actually pivoting, especially during this period at the moment, and almost nodding to digitalization, that it's something that they need to be trying to do. I just thought I'd butt in and say that. As I was listening, it came to me.
I think that's been going on since 2015. In actual fact, we did see a switch, and a trend that people were saying, you know, this is not a nice to have anymore. You know, we have no choice. And I think we're beginning to see that. And I would say actually most of the projects that we have seen or been involved in over the last 10 or 12 years have always had an element of you've got no choice. I mean, one of the reasons why we did a huge amount of work in Australia in between the period of 2012 and 2015 and 16 and before the oil price crash was the fact that they were just short of people. They didn't have the human resources to run oil and gas and mining operations in the way that they've been run in the previous 20 years. They just didn't have anybody. I mean, it was a bit of a standing joke that, you know, if you sat in a cafe in Perth long enough and you'd had anything to do with anything technical, you get offered a job. And you know, there were engineers swapping from one company to another and getting 15% pay rises every 6 months because there was such a shortage of people. And so the knock-on effect was, you know, if you're going to drill, you know, 10,000 coal bed methane wells across Queensland, you know, and your traditional number of wells per operator is 20 wells per operator, then you're going to need to recruit 500 operators. And that was just impossible. So then the driver was okay, if we can't have, you know, what's the number of wells per operator we need to make this viable? And the answer was over 100 or even 120 or even 200. And then, you know, if you do that, how do you run an operation with 10,000 wells with one operator for 200 wells? Well, you've got to have the data and information to tell them where to go on a daily basis. Yeah. And so that one thing unlocked the comms. You know, yes, we've got to have comms. Yes, we've got to have data. Yes, we've got to store the data. Yes, we've got to have a center. Yes, we've got to collaborate. And everything was unlocked basically from that one thing. And I think that is still the case. And, you know, there's been a couple of, you know, very interesting results from that, I would say. You know, one, the more remote your operation is, the more inherently obvious it is to do things remotely because it's difficult to get there. And so the drive has been very strong in these very remote places. And, you know, when I was in BP and we started Field the Future in 2003, the surprise was that we thought the biggest uptake was going to be in Aberdeen, in Houston and in Alaska. In actual fact, the pool was from Azerbaijan, Indonesia and Angola. And the reason is if you sit in Houston and you support an operation offshore in the Gulf of Mexico and you have a problem, well, you can get any vendor on the planet into your office within a couple of hours and you can get them offshore within half a day. If you're actually in Tanggu on, you know, Papua New Guinea, like, you know, it's 48 hours and 4 flights from Jakarta, let alone anywhere else.
So for the people working in assets where they sense the end, often then they'll leave and try and get another job if at all possible. So the asset life ends up actually shortening even quicker then once the end gets in sight. So do you think there's a risk of that, and so as a result, do companies actually need to keep investing to maintain the talent pool until the very end?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, there are some things that you can do with the talent pool to be more efficient, you know, and multi-skilled technicians, multi-skilled offshore maintenance technicians is one of them. So, I mean, this is something that I think the whole industry has been pretty reluctant to move to. But we were doing it offshore in the mid-90s in Southern North Sea because we had unmanned platforms and we had very small teams. So we actually had, again, no choice. So we moved to, you know, control and electrical technicians, and we merged operators with maintenance technicians. And so we had operator maintainers as well. So I think, you know, in some respects, there is a way of upskilling the crew that you remain with to give them an incentive to stay. But I think, you know, there are a number of opposing things that go on there. If you upskill your technicians and go to multi-skilled technicians, then these are not people you can just pick up off the street later on. So you've got to keep them happy, and you probably want to be in a model where they are working for the operator. If you've gone to an outsourced maintenance technician, it doesn't work very well because the turnover in these outsourced maintenance crews is historically been too high. Now that may not be the case in the current environment, but often, you know, again, you know, the strategy is, do you go for a small in-house or, you know, a smaller in-house, very committed team, or do you go external, you know, low cost, but low cost per head, but maybe not low cost overall?
Yeah. So what about new folks coming into the industry? What about, say, graduates coming in? Because presumably, I mean, shortening field life, what are we talking, 2 years or 10 years? You probably say it depends, but.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does depend a lot on the individual circumstances. And obviously, you know, there's a subsurface effect about, you know, is there anything else left to be got at, versus, you know, the economic field life cutoff. So, you know, those are two different things. And in some respects, the Norwegians have been smart in setting targets for, you are not allowed to leave until you've got a certain recovery factor.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, and everybody's known about that up front. Or it's been known about for a long time, so it's not been avoidable. Whereas, you know, so that's the recovery factor cutoff is different to the economic cutoff.
Yeah, that's totally. I think that's a good point. And what I'm thinking as well is that oil and gas has got years and years of knowledge built up into it. There's so much interesting stuff to learn from it, and obviously I've benefited from the last 20 years of being around interesting projects. You learn stuff, you see how things are done. I mean, there's very few industries that do such big capital intensive projects. The health and safety around it now is huge compared to the wildcatting days when it didn't matter, you know. So in terms of a knowledge base for someone young to come in, actually there's a tremendous upskilling and learning that they could go through, understanding that it's not a job for life, because it probably won't be around for someone to spend 40 to 50 years as a career in, or certainly not in the way we know it. But nonetheless, I think you could learn a lot from coming into the industry, because there's just so much established knowledge, and there's all these people who've been in it for years who could teach folks stuff. But if we don't attract the young people in, there's no one to pass that knowledge on to, or to take it elsewhere, particularly thinking just selfishly in the UK, you know, how does the UK capitalize on the knowledge?
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's been a lot of talk about you know, the big crew change and the loss of knowledge and all of that stuff for many, many years. And in fact, it was one of the things that drove the setup of Field of the Future and BP in 2003. However, we were predicting in 2003 the big crew change would happen in 10 years' time. And, you know, here we are almost another 10 years beyond it, still talking about whether it's going to happen or not. So I think, you know, there is, you know, the industry has been fairly good at retaining some of that knowledge. Some companies have extended retirement dates and put American companies I know have said, okay, you never have to come into the office. You can work 3 days a week. You're on the phone. You're on call. We'll call you when we need you, and we'll pay you this. And that can actually be a pretty nice way to slide into retirement for some people and still retain the knowledge. So it's a bit of a different approach than we'd have in this country. Per se, I think yes, absolutely. There is there's still opportunities in the industry. It's still a very interesting career, and I think there is a difference between where you are in the world on this. It may not be popular to be a petroleum or a production engineer or an operations engineer in oil and gas in Canada or North America or Europe, but if you go to Azerbaijan or you go to Malaysia or you go to these, it's still, you know, one of the jobs to get. So when people say we have a shortage of engineers, well, we might have a shortage of engineers in some parts of the world, but actually globally, I'm not sure that's true. You know, and you know, I went to a conference, a digital conference in China 2 years back, and blimey, I mean, they had 6,000 master's students and 20,000 undergraduates doing petroleum and production engineering.
I sometimes think, I think you need that new talent, and even if it's to pass the torch to, because I think that's sometimes your path to innovation as well, and how the industry would carry on to evolve and innovate as they go forward. And that's how I often sort of think about new talent, because a lot of the things that, when you pass the torch and you pass that knowledge and those skills, a lot of those skills are transferable as well in some areas. And then I think, like I said, that aids innovation. And I think that's how the industry grows. That's how it adapts. You know, that's how it's still here in the future. Well, hopefully. So.
Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And, you know, it's going to be interesting what the roles of the traditional integrated oil companies are, and how they transform into a low carbon environment. And the one good thing about having worked in those big organizations is that internal opportunities are available and you can get spun around. And certainly I was talking to an engineer that we worked with in the past, and he's been upstream in oil and gas, and he's just managed to get on a solar and renewables gig inside the same company. So certainly internally in these big companies, people are looking at opportunities to transfer the knowledge, and some of the skills are clearly transferable. You know, offshore wind is not so different for a structural engineer than an offshore platform necessarily. So there clearly are opportunities there. I mean, I do have some concerns that, you know, about whether the big companies really put, you know, new graduates through the kind of the 3 years of spinning you around and seeing everything, which I got when I joined BP, you know, where you got to go offshore and you got to do reservoir engineering and you got to do a well intervention course, and you did petroleum economics and reservoir courses and safety courses, and you know, they pushed you through 20 weeks worth of courses within the first 2 years on everything. You know, everything you can think of. Even if you weren't going to be a driller, you got sent on drilling courses, you know. So I'm not sure how much of that is available anymore, and how those skills are acquired. And it's a question about difference between being a deep technical specialist and being actually a pretty technical generalist who's got a reasonable understanding of the entire value chain. You know, and has got a reasonable understanding of subsurface and wells and drilling and facilities and commercial and all that sort of good stuff.
And that takes time. You
Yeah.
can't get that in a year, whatever you do,
No,
realistically.
and you know, it's certainly the big IOCs were very good at doing that for a good while. And if you still look at, you know, the leadership teams in these companies, they've actually, you know, they've condensed a huge amount of experience into a short space of time.
So a thought was occurring to me there about decommissioning, because I know assets are starting to be decommissioned in the North Sea, and it's always a very difficult decision, but it's also a huge liability, I guess, sitting on the balance sheets of these oil companies. And so if, I guess, the end of field life decision has to take into account the cost of decommissioning, presumably.
Yep.
And
Yep.
and that cost is, well, it's kind of a fixed cost, but it doesn't really change with the oil price.
No, exactly right.
The only hope you can have is that the costs come down pretty rapidly as folks get slick at it. But it's a one-way street. You know, the infrastructure's gone at that point. And
that's right. And I think, you know, I mean, I think, you know, certainly in the UK sector, there's been some work which has been done very well. You know, the plug and abandon kind of work that's been going on for a significant amount of time to, you know, plug and abandon all the wells which have ever been drilled in the North Sea is a good thing. You know, you can contrast that with other areas, even other areas in first world countries where they actually don't know where all their wells are, you know, which is quite scary. So some of that is being done well. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think understanding where the liabilities are, you know, that's going to be a very big challenge, and whether the new operators are on the hook for the liabilities, or the initial operators are on the hook for the liabilities. And you know, that's not something I'm particularly conversant with.
It's a tough play, because surely the government at some point is going to be interested, because it has a direct impact on jobs in the area. I guess this is, and obviously we're talking very speculatively here, but I can imagine that it's not just an economic decision in terms of the oil, when you're talking about a whole industry disappearing potentially in areas. Governments get quite interested at that point.
Yes, I'm surprised there's not more interest in it now, and haven't been more interested before. And I think, you know, there possibly was a missed opportunity maybe 10 years back to do a little bit more around what the Norwegians have done, and really try and push the recovery factors and say you can't do this until you've got to this point. I think it is, again, different with oil and gas. You know, oil, it's a much bigger issue. The gas infrastructure tends to be such that you can go to very, very low rates and still be viable if you do it right. And the infrastructure is not as difficult, not as big, not as dirty, etc., etc. So
So true. So what do you think is going to be the most interesting thing to watch over the next, I don't know, 2 years, or there may be a technology or a change? If it was a horse race, what would be the name of the horse you'd back?
I think for me, there's going to be a couple of things. I think there will be some companies, and maybe small to medium-sized companies, who will come out of the pack with a radically new way of running their business.
So this is oil production company, oil and gas producers.
Yes, and midstream companies, and we're already beginning to see that. There are some companies that we've worked with. There are some which we've not worked with, which are companies to watch. Certainly the one that people talk about a lot in the US is EOG, and it's worth looking at their quarterly reports which have been being published. It's interesting to see that their quarterly reports to the stock market include a whole page on technology and a whole page on culture and organization, and you don't see that in any other quarterly reports, or rarely, certainly not to the level of detail. And they keep their cards pretty close to their chest, but clearly their performance is outdoing the market at the moment. So I think we are beginning to see that. I think we are going to see you know, in the big companies, we're going to see some consolidation maybe into regions. So I think there's maybe a move to a regional support model rather than a country-based stroke asset support model. So how can you share resources across, you know, across country boundaries and across multiple assets? And so that, you know, will get the support costs down. And so instead of everybody having a pipeline engineer, or you know, you'll be able to share them. I think, you know, there are some interesting moves which are going on in mining around moving to full remote control of operations. It is made easier by the fact that they don't have the end of field life problem. So the mines that we've worked with in South America, I mean, you know, one of them celebrated its 50th anniversary and the projected lifetime is at least another 150 years. So, you know, they just, you know, there's no reason not to spend the money as soon as possible, because the sooner you spend it, the more benefit you get. So they have different drivers, but I think what they've done in terms of integrating value chains from what they call pit to port, and the fact that they've removed multiple control rooms in the field in mine locations to city centre locations is a trend we're going to see in oil and gas. So you could imagine, you know, a company saying, you know, why, you know, and maybe it works better with some of the gas operators like Perenco, but why wouldn't you could remotely control all of your offshore gas assets from London, and it's not, technically it's not a big stretch. Organizationally it's a challenge, but technically it's a stretch. And then you can manage your entire business as a portfolio, as a region, and you know, get some synergy from doing that. And I think we will begin to see that happening. I think the other thing that's happened in mining, which is kind of interesting, and Rio Tinto has done this, is they've organized themselves into asset types. So what they've said is, you know, we're going to have a copper mining group and an iron ore mining group and a gold mining group and a potash mining group. And actually a copper mine in Salt Lake City has got more in common with a copper mine in Mongolia than it does with an iron ore mine down the road.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a peer group model. And I think that's something that could work well for the big multi-regional, multinational companies that says, actually, we're going to have a gas business, we're going to have an offshore oil business, we're going to have an onshore oil high well count business, or a shale oil type business. And you can already begin to see that in the fact that, you know, BP spun out BPX in North America just to run shale assets. Now, okay, that's geographically described at the moment, but there's no reason why they couldn't support shale gas assets in Argentina, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, so I think we'll potentially begin to see that. And I think we're going to see the integration of a lot of technologies coming together. So it will be technologies like analytics, it will be machine learning, it will be data capture, it will be automation, it will be robotization, it will be drones, it will be mobile worker, it will be all of those things. And I think, you know, until we get all of those things integrated and easily integrated, it's hard, you know, that's when the real transformation will come, I think. I don't think one technology on its own is going to do it.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly right.
And there's a lot of people advocating one technology is going to transform it, and I just don't get it.
This is back to what you were saying earlier about the early digital oil field. It was a combination of better instrumentation, better bandwidth, connectivity, some web technology. All these things had to come together to deliver.
Plus the integration with process workflow.
That's right. New ways of thinking about it.
And how you run the process workflow, and that comes into organization. And, you know, and I think, you know, what we've learned and what we've seen is, even though, you know, there has been challenges with a lot of the technologies, and certainly the integration of large, diverse, you know, data sets, which have, you know, not quality assured, has been extraordinarily difficult. And there's a lot of, you know, heroic failures have been seen in the last 10 years on this stuff. You know, but even when you get that bit right, it doesn't mean to say that the organizational change isn't still a challenge. So, you know, I mean, what will be going on at the moment, you know, with COVID-19 is that a lot of platforms in the North Sea and a lot of operations in, you know, offshore Angola or offshore Azerbaijan, you know, they'll be down on skeleton crews. So they'll be down on Christmas crews. They'll have taken everybody off. Everybody will be remote, who can be working remotely will be working remotely. And so this is an opportunity, in many respects, it's an opportunity to say, okay, so you did have 100 people on the platform. Now you've got 60 or 50 or 70. Why can't you sustain that? Now, the answer to that sustainment, you know, or the barrier to sustaining that probably won't be the technology, because we've been proving that during COVID-19 by everybody working remotely and doing this sort of stuff. But the challenges will probably be around organization and governance and things like that. So if you've got a technician who's been working four on, four off, expat technician out of Baku, and he's getting paid on a certain contract to do that, then he's going to be very reluctant to get paid less to do it all remotely. And that will be the kind of things which will be the barriers. And, you know, we've been in situations in Australia and Canada where we work with clients where they've said, we have to wait until we've got the union negotiations over and done with before we can do this.
Yeah.
It's that sort of stuff, I think, which is going to be the challenge. It's going to be, you know, what's the new operations and organizational model that's going to sustain this? You know, the technology needs to be there. It needs to be, you know, it needs to work. It needs to be simple. It needs to, you know, needs to support the processes and all the workflows. But I think it's how that technology is used and how those processes are going to be run, which is the issue. And overcoming 20 years or 30 years of this is the way we've done it.
But I think that's a fascinating summary, or excellent way to summarize it, really, Tony. What you're saying is there's going to be change. You're seeing the green shoots of some success. Some companies are now figuring this out. No, it's a bit secretive maybe, but the numbers are there implying it. There's going to be change. But as usual, there's going to be some difficulties as well, and it will be around the people and the process.
Yes, people are process and organizational change. I mean, I think I think the other thing is that, you know, we've been not good at in oil and gas industry is how we contract in services or even, you know, technologies or even things like power. You know, if you look at, you know, why do we keep buying gas turbines and sticking them offshore when we could just buy megawatts off of GE or ABB, you know, and getting them to run it. And that's a contractual problem. That's because our projects have been contracting these things the same way, and they haven't updated their approach for saying how do we procure this.
That's a great subject, and that was almost a subject for a completely separate video. But procurement's a massive aspect of this, isn't it? Because it's
especially in greenfield projects, absolutely.
Yeah, you have to change the way you buy stuff at the end of the day. You can have all the design you want, but if it just goes down the same process for buying it, you end up with the lowest cost. That's pretty much the only driver. Correct.
And I think, you know, the root cause of that is, you know, how you incentivize them, the project directors, and how you incentivize the operations managers. I mean, I was in the position of being an operations manager on a new project, and I was fortunate enough to have, you know, initially have a project director who was pretty enlightened, who was willing to listen to his operations manager. But that's often not the case. And when you have an operations manager reports to a project director, well, he can jump up and down as much as you want, but you know, at the end of the day, his bonus might not be great if he does, you know? So, you know, the whole system has not been there, you know, it's been there to reduce CapEx at all costs, you know, rather than trying to optimize both CapEx and OpEx in tandem, really.
Yeah, okay.
And I think, you know, as an ex-operations guy, if we're allowed to influence projects early enough, we can make significant differences to both CapEx and OpEx. And we've been doing the work. We've done probably a dozen, maybe more, 14 studies over the last 3 or 4 years, and we're seeing an absolute trend. So we're seeing, you know, if you get in early enough on a greenfield project, we're seeing reductions in OpEx predicted OPEX for year one of between 50 and 80%. And we're seeing reductions in CapEx of between 25 and 45%, 40%. And we've got numbers to justify that. So we can see it in the, topside weight reduction, in terms of greenfield projects. So if you move to a remote, unmanned type of operating model, and you can embed that in early enough in the project, you can make significant savings.
Yeah.
And it's not just more CapEx to reduce OPEX, it's lower OPEX and lower CapEx.
That sounds like a no-brainer in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. We've presented, and as you know, you've been in some of the conferences where we presented this. I mean, people don't believe it, or are extremely skeptical about this. But we've been involved with some projects where it follows through. I mean, if you want to reduce OPEX, then you've got to reduce the number of people on board. If you want to reduce the number of people on board, you need to reduce the amount of work that there is for them to do. The easiest way to reduce the work is to reduce equipment.
Exactly.
Yeah, and if you reduce equipment, you have less CapEx.
That's right.
The logic
actually works. Yeah.
The logic is right. So and the companies that we've seen do this very well, they have ultra high availability. So they get very high availability, but they don't get it by sparing. Because if you spare,
got more equipment.
You got more equipment, so you need more people, more maintenance. And not only that, it gives the procurement guys a get out of jail card, because if you spare by having two 100s or three 50%, then if they buy not such good kit, it doesn't matter so much. Whereas if you've only got one 100, you've got to make sure it's absolutely right. So the attitude of the people who are speccing the equipment and in the project phase is different.
Yeah. It's I think we could almost do another video on how to actually minimum man. But we've already chatted for an hour, pretty much.
Yeah.
So it just flies by.
No, it's been good.
It's brilliant. I mean, the insights that you have, Tony, are just fantastic, and the way you're able to tie it in with just case studies from history, and because you've got the credibility from having worked there, it's no one can argue. It's not like.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a workshop 3 weeks before Christmas in Houston, and it was quite funny. And there was a bunch of operations. It was mostly operations guys, and we were looking at the design of a next generation semi-submersible, for deep water Gulf of Mexico. And there was a new Gulf of Mexico standard design being developed, and this was a cross-company standard design. Yeah. And it was using tried and tested technology off the shelf, which means cheap, of course.
Oh, okay.
And we ran a workshop where we went through the equipment list, and we were challenging what could be removed, or what could be done elsewhere. So could you run a cable and do remote power, run a power from another platform, all that sort of stuff. And it was very, very interesting in the fact that even the operations guys were saying, well, no, we have to have one of these. And I was going, why do you need one of these? And they were going, well,
we've always had one.
One of these, nitrogen generator or oxygen, air systems. If you go fully electric, what do you need air systems for? All of that sort of stuff. So you can collapse this stuff if you know what it's doing. But and we spent 2 or 3 days convincing them that this was okay, and eventually they took it.
A huge thank you so much for that. That was a brilliant conversation. I know I personally learned a great deal. And for anybody watching, I hope that you're able to take away some key parts from what Tony was talking about there. If you've got any questions or anything, please, no matter what platform you're on, pop them down below. And as always, we'll get back to you as quickly as we can. But thank you so much for joining us today.